The War of 1812 is a story as much about a nation in conflict with itself as it is a clash of countries. Early 19th century America is a loose association of scattered states, bordered by a vast wilderness to the west and miles of ocean to its east. Isolated communities are surrounded by uncharted and hostile territory. Americans are intertwined by one thread: shipping.
The British at this time are fighting an important war against Napoleonic France, and in order to fight this war, they need manpower for the Royal Navy. So they're stopping American ships on the high seas and forcing Americans to serve in the Navy.
From its outset, the War of 1812 has been of secondary concern to the British. For the previous 9 years, they've been preoccupied in an epic war against the greatest military genius of the age, Napoleon.
With the war going on against Napoleon in Europe, the British are very tight on what soldiers can be sent over to the Americas. They have a few regiments in the country, the one stationed in Canada, of course. So the main thing is a holding action. Once America has been stopped from the invasion of Canada, there's very little that Britain can do until Napoleon is out of the way.
In early 1814, the British finally defeat the French emperor. That July, thousands of battle-tested redcoats set sail for the Chesapeake Bay to launch the first invasion of the United States. American troops, who have been fighting in mostly poorly trained and poorly equipped militias for almost 2 years, are about to face a force unlike any they have ever seen. The British have every reason to expect victory. For the past year, the British fleet in North America has been tightening its blockade of the Atlantic coast.
The British are wreaking havoc on the American countryside. There's virtually no opposition. The American military presence is not in the Chesapeake in the way it should be. All important regular assets are up along the Canadian border. So it's up to the Maryland, Virginia militia to defend an extensive border. They can't keep up.
August 24th, 1814, would go down as one of the blackest days in American history. It began with a humiliating defeat at Bladensburg, Maryland, and ended with the destruction of the nation's capital. The events of this one day would test the mettle of a young nation and provide some of the most memorable moments in America's so-called forgotten war. While the British overrun American forces and advance on Washington, just 6 miles away, one woman remains firmly entrenched in the White House, the First Lady, Dolly Madison.
I insist on waiting till the large picture of General Washington is taken, so I have ordered the frame to be broken and the painting taken out. It is done.
The First Lady is among the last to evacuate the city. She finally boards her carriage, searching for her husband. By 8 p.m., British forces, led by Major General Ross, enter Washington.
It was never expected that an army of 4,000 men could march with little or no difficulty, take and have at its mercy the capital of the United States.
In retaliation for burning the Canadian Parliament at York the previous April, British troops prepare to set fire to Washington's government buildings. Redcoats, under the command of Vice Admiral Coburn, break into the Capitol. They stage a mock legislation and vote unanimously to burn the building. One resident watches the fire from her rooftop.
No drawing room was ever as brilliantly lit as the whole city that night. As flames burst through the roof of the Capitol, there was a roll of thunder.
At about 10:30 p.m., the men move on to another key government target, the White House. In the dining room, they find the table set. Coburn orders wine poured, and in a sarcastic toast to the president, drinks to Jemmy's health. Soldiers rampage through the rooms, grabbing souvenirs, including a ceremonial sword and a pair of rhinestone buckles. Even Major General Ross pockets President Madison's love letters to Dolly. Outside the mansion, the Redcoats pitched their torches through the windows, engulfing the White House in flames.
The destruction of Washington's public buildings, these fires, the glow of which was seen 50 miles away, struck at the hearts of many Americans wherever they were.
Every American heart is bursting with shame and indignation at the catastrophe, recalls George Douglas, a militia private. Perhaps no one feels the emotions more deeply than President Madison, who watches the fires from horseback in Virginia.
There's no sign of panic. There was intense concern about making sure the government didn't fold up, and he felt, of course, a responsibility. At that stage, Madison was thinking, where would he find Dolly? Where would the rest of the government be? How could he reconvene them to show that the government could still function and still exist in an effective form?
The next morning, August 25th, the British set the Library of Congress and the Navy Yard afire as storm clouds threatened overhead. But at 2 o'clock that afternoon, two events would transform a burning Washington into a scene beyond comprehension. With little warning, one of the most powerful hurricanes in its history hits Washington. Lightning splits clouds open as gale-force winds tear through the city.
Out of nowhere comes this uncanny storm, which not only dumps a tremendous torrential downpour, but it rages against this British column.
One redcoat recalls the fury of this perfect storm.
Our column was completely dispersed, as if it had received a total defeat. Some of the men flying for shelter behind walls and buildings, and others falling flat upon the ground to prevent themselves from being carried away. Such was the violence of the wind that two pieces of cannon were fairly lifted from the ground and borne several yards away.
What has started out as a blessing is about to become a catastrophic event of epic proportions. As the hurricane wreaks destruction throughout the burning city, a tornado suddenly appears from the sky and shears through the center of the Capitol. For 2 hours, the immense storm rages through Washington, dousing most of the flames that have turned the Capitol into an inferno.
We now know a tornado actually touches down like the wrathful hand of God from the Old Testament and inflicts more casualties in the middle of that British column than they even suffered in Bladensburg.
When the storm clears out the next day, so do the British. The invasion force returns to Benedict, Maryland, a battered and bewildered unit. Meanwhile, the President and First Lady finally reunite at a roadside tavern. They return to Washington on August 27th and view the devastation.